also going to go ahead and have our friends at Pioneer Biomedical, Jose. He's just going to say a few short words just to tell you a little bit about what they can offer, and then we'll go ahead and get started with Carol and Matt. All right, Jose, the floor is yours.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out last night. Hope you guys enjoyed had a great time and enjoyed some good food. If you guys didn't make it, I'm Jose with Pioneer Biomedical and Adepta Medical. We're a rental company who specializes in a couple of different modalities. We do patient monitoring, or Pioneer does patient monitoring, telemetry, AGMs, extension modules, and anything you can think of. Adepta Medical does everything IV pumps. So yeah, if you guys would like to talk more about it, we'll be downstairs, far back left corner. We feel that the biomeds and back of the house staff is underappreciated, and we'd like to, just tell you guys how much we value you guys. If you guys ever need any help, we're here for you.
Thank you, Jose. We appreciate it. All right, Carol, Matt, the floor is yours. Everybody, we are ready for our part 2 of our CMMS session. Carol, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you, ma'am. So if any of you, first off, thanks for coming back. It's always a good thing. If you have more questions about what we talked about in the first session, or you have questions about the second, Matt's and my contact information is here. I'll leave business cards here. Grab extra handouts so I don't have to carry them on my next flight, whatever. But we're happy to have more conversations. If you have questions, suggestions, feedback about how it went and whatnot on either this morning, the first session, or what we're going to go through here this late morning session. I keep wanting to say afternoon, and I don't know why. Okay, so we're going to start out again. This session is about applying the standardized codes, how they can drive value, because we don't want this just to be an administrative exercise. We want it to drive value. Matt's going to start us out in the first half of this session with, as the expert literally wrote the book on the AEM programs. And you've probably heard him speak before, but he's just going to dig in even deeper. So Matt, I'm going to get you started.
That's great. Thanks, Carol. Yeah, so this is the book, it's 30 pages, so it's not War and Peace. But I wanted to mention, since this came out in 2017, a lot has changed around AEMs. Alternative Equipment Management is what AEM stands for. And of course, I think by now, just about everybody knows it's a way to, if you have good data, that you can shift away from manufacturers' recommendations for PM and save yourself some time. So we'll talk a little more about that and how some of this work that we've been doing supports that. What's really changed, though, is back in 2018, when AEMs were starting to get popular, you'd have a Joint Commission surveyor come around and ask, do you have an AEM program? And a lot of people at that point thought the safe answer was to say, no, we do it by the book. We don't do AEM. We follow manufacturer's recommendations. And shift forward to the last couple of years and continuing on, I think, if the surveyor asks for that and you say, no, I follow manufacturer's recommendations across the board, they'll say, why do you not have an AEM program? It's very well accepted by Joint Commission to the extent that they're expecting people to have some kind of a program in place. And so if you answer that you do, you need to have some good answers about how you've implemented it. And just to mention the things on the left-hand side of this slide, why do you do PM, or you do AEM programs? There's opportunities to reduce the cost of PM. I think we're all familiar with cases where manufacturers recommend long sort of, you might say, CYA kind of PM procedures that essentially reproduce their own quality assurance manufacturing processes and are just impractical for the kind of work that we do, which is screening work, trying to quickly get an idea if there are problems that deserve more of our attention. And so the opportunity to move away from the kind of overkill that you'll see in some PM procedures from the manufacturers is what AEM is about. There are times when you might end up doing more, but mostly it's about reducing cost. And equipment safety equivalent to the manufacturer's recommendation. That's the Joint Commission requirement. It's based on the CMS requirements that if you do something that's going to maybe save you some time and money, you don't want to reduce equipment safety. And it's almost go without saying, because of course we don't. As I was saying this morning earlier, we're all in it because we want to do a good job. So we want to take care of patients. We want to do our piece for safe and effective patient care. So of course, we don't want to do something that's going to compromise safety. And we want to stay in compliance with CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and Joint Commission requirements. So let's go to the next slide. Just some definitions that I'll talk about. PM, I call it planned maintenance, and I'll tell you why I don't use preventive maintenance, but planned maintenance, whatever. Last session this morning, we talked about some different work order types and some also known as aliases that you could use. By the way, we don't care if you want to call this something else as long as it's the same concept and supports some of the benchmarking objectives we talked about. CMS and the Joint Commission break that into two things: PM activities, meaning the steps in that procedure, the things that you do, check this output, measure that, leakage current, whatever the activity is. And PM frequency is however you schedule and decide what to do. And that can be, typically we do that like this is due in October or November. But in Joint Commission jargon, that means any kind of scheduling. If you're talking about ventilators and you do those whenever after a certain amount of runtime, that's PM frequency, even though it could be irregular in terms of by the calendar. So an AEM program, an AEM procedure lets you adjust either or both of these activities or frequencies. You could change the kinds of things you do. You could drop out a step, you could change a step, check the defibrillator output at 2 levels instead of 10 levels, as long as you've got data. And or you could change the PM frequency and say, you know, my records show that I don't have to do this twice a year, I could do it once a year, and I'll give that a try. And you can, with good data, say, I'm going to make the frequency 0. You can do a run to failure kind of option that says, this otoscope ophthalmoscope unit does not get more, it gets safer or more reliable because I send an expensive technician around to turn on the light bulb and see if it lights up. So there are things that we can consider at least dropping them all together. So PM, there are two aspects, and I like to highlight this because there are some people who make the point that PM is it's preventive, meaning we only do things that actually prevent future failures. And that's the first point here, device restoration. You return the equipment to its normal operating conditions, replace batteries, clean filters, whatever it takes to get it back as close as you can to new, but at least to good functioning, safe and functional condition. And I would call that genuine preventive maintenance because that prevents future problems. Replacing the battery early enough makes sure that it doesn't, reduces the likelihood that it's going to fail unexpectedly down the road. Most of what we do is not really preventive in that sense. It's verifying the performance and safety. And the term that a lot of people use is finding latent failures or hidden failures. It's the kind of thing that is not obvious, but it requires people like us to come around with special knowledge and special test equipment to find a shortcoming. So that defibrillator output, the user may not know that the defibrillator output or the ESU output is lower than the setting. They may have some sense that they're having problems, but they're not able to detect, this flow rate of this infusion pump a little bit slower than it should be. We're the only ones who can find that out. So that's another big part of PM is to look at those, look for latent failures. Next question, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, yes, okay. Just terminology. I've already started about it. PM procedure is the activities and frequencies that are all listed together. The OEM version is what the manufacturer recommends, and the PM AEM is one that we invent. Next slide, please. So one of the things we also want to do is make, as I said before, we don't want to, because we put something in an AEM program, we don't want to reduce its safety or effectiveness. And the question is, how do you know? Can we find a way to identify where maybe we went too far, or maybe we could go a little farther? And so it takes some kind of a metric. And when I've talked to people about what they use, they sometimes do things like failure rates, which is a good measure. Mean time between failure is a particular kind of failure rate calculation. We'll talk a bit about that on the next slide. But really the issue is that there are some failures that could have been prevented by better PM and some that could have been discovered by better PM, as we were talking about. I had some examples on the previous slide, but you can already see in the examples here some material from earlier this morning about failure codes and different types of failures, and the fact that some of these are related to PM and some are not. For example, we had the example of misprogramming an infusion pump. Well, you can do PM all day long and you're not going to solve that problem. You need to know about it. You need to do something about it, but the answer is not more PM. And so distinguishing PM-related failures, which are defined here on this screen, from other types of failures is an important part of what you could do with this information. So next slide. So the standard calculation for mean time between failures is at the top. It looks at the devices that you're analyzing over some period of time, and then the denominator is all the failures. And it's pretty easy to get your CMMS to calculate that. What you actually want to look at is maybe MTBF for your entire fleet of your inventory, but probably break it down into some different categories. Maybe the equipment in this facility versus that facility, or look at infusion pumps versus imaging equipment, or whatever you want to know. Have some flexibility in how your CMMS tracks what it gives you, what the number means, what it applies to, whatever set of devices it applies to. But we've been talking about in other contexts making a modified version of the mean time between PM-related failures. In other words, failures that could be made less likely by better PM, as per the previous slide. And so the equation looks something like this. So you can also get your CMMS to do this kind of calculation. and use the numbers that you get to help guide your PM program. So for example, if you see this starting to drop off, increase, mean time between failure, low is good, high is bad, you start to see it tick up. That suggests, I wonder if there's something about my PM program, maybe my AEM decisions, that cause the mean time between failures to grow a bit. And this can be a fairly sensitive measure, I mean, in terms of being proactive. If this is automatically calculated by your CMMS, then you don't have to wait for down the road to get some printed report. You could start to see things crop up fairly early on. But to make this work, you have to change that denominator to PM-related failures only, which means you need to have a good failure code field, and you need to be able to distinguish PM-related failures from other kinds of failures. So once you build in something like that set of failure codes that we were talking about before, you can start to automate this. You can start to get a early on kind of indication of problems. I know I've done some consulting with a group that they felt like they were always behind the curve on problems related to BD Alaris pumps. And the being behind the curve meant, you know, they were hearing from users who were losing confidence in the Alaris equipment. And it was not showing up in the CMMS data in a timely fashion. And so they've moved to something along this line that has their reaction is that this moves them a little bit closer to real time. And so they're in a position to be less reactive, or at least more quickly reactive. So next slide. So this is the sort of thing that I was talking about in the previous slide. What you want to monitor is both MTBF and PM-related MTBF over time. And there's another 4 different kinds of equipment. For example, you might want to track the Alaris pumps because they have plenty of failures to be attended to. And for different failure code types, you might want to monitor failures related to programming, failures related to no problem found. There are all sorts of things, analyses that you can do once you've got some granularity in your failure code data. And then respond. When you see trends, certainly you want to respond. There's some people who are implementing a way that pretty much when you see a PM-related failure pop up in the data, there's a flag very quickly for management in your HTM program to say, I want to take a look at that. Most of the time there's nothing there, but it's an early warning system for to help you anticipate some developing trends. And the response could be all kinds of things, but in terms of AEM programs, it could be to say, well, the idea to go from once every 6 months to once every 5 years, maybe that was over the top. And so let me dial that back. And it lets you, so if you can say to the Joint Commission surveyor, yes, we do a data-driven AEM process, and yes, we have this performance metric that focuses on PM-related failures, then you're going to be in good shape when the surveyors come to talk to you. So I'm going to stop with that material about the AEM programs for questions and discussion before turning it back to Carol to talk about her technology planning piece. I'm curious, you know, I'm not, go ahead, Carol.
I say hands are popping up
Great.
in the back.
Yeah, Mark Porter with Lawrence Memorial. Just wanted to confirm that the Joint Commission doesn't allow lasers and radiology equipment in AEM. Is that correct?
Correct. So could you hear that, Matt?
No, but you're right. For some reason, if I were in my cynical mode, I would say that those industries had better lobbyists than we do. So, but you're right. There are something. I call those things that are on the taboo list. You can't do them. You can't put them in an AEM program.
However, for great operational performance of your department, the metrics that Matt just gave you are ideal, right? Because, you know, in my world, I want to still know about that because I want to be able to go back to the manufacturer and say, give them feedback about the device, right? So if you're still monitoring these sort of mean time between failures, it's a feedback loop that should be more robust than it is. So, but you are absolutely correct from a regulations perspective. They're taboo.
Yeah. I will mention that we've had some conversations, the people working on that project and the FDA. They're looking for ways to improve how they collect data from the field post-market, and they may adopt some of this approach in how they collect data.
Right. Thanks for bringing that up, Matt. I forgot about that. Yes. Another question in the room. How do you establish a baseline, Matt?
Yeah, that's tough because, you know, ideally you would say, let's have some period of time, I don't know, a couple of years at least of data where we follow the manufacturer's recommendations and we can see, you know, use that as a basis for tracking going forward. Okay, I think I see the argument there, but the fact is that hardly any of us were really following manufacturers' recommendations carefully for a long period of time, because for a long time we didn't have to do that. And so it's hard to get the baseline. So what I have heard, and I'd be interested if there's different feedback from people in the room, the Joint Commission is not giving people a hard time on that. They just want to see that you got a system in place and see that you're monitoring something, and when you explain how you came up with this, they seem to be okay with that. And I think we're past the point of being able to say, do the baseline. I'd say jump in, make data-driven decisions, and monitor your performance and get on with it.
Yeah, I would say from a personal experience, before I left in my last life, we had a situation where we did not have that process well defined and created into sort of a policy-like form, and we got all wrapped around axles. So to Matt's point, had we had it more formalized in terms of how it was documented, I think we would have gotten a lot less pushback. I think we still would have gotten pushback because it was very early in the rollout of AEM. But yeah, personal experience wounds, it was have it documented and you're probably going to get a lot less pushback. I'll come back to you, David in the back.
So I think the other part of this, so when I was at Beta, we rolled out the AEM. The biggest question the Joint Commission had, we hadn't even thought of, is, well, how often do you go back and review this and determine, you know, maybe this type of equipment I do every year, I review the data. Another one is in 4 years, 5 years, never even thought of that.
Right.
So that's, I think Matt is kind of implying that is once you come up with an AEM, it's not from now on, I never do this, right? So maybe I never do pulse oxygen again. So maybe every 5 years I review it to see, are we starting to see any failure? Because now I've changed my PM schedule.
So Matt, did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard some of it. Yeah, we need to do periodic reviews of the decisions that we made, and we need to and if we can at least get some early warning, that's good, so we don't wait 5 years to see, you know, what worked and what didn't work. But I think we always have to be in a continuous review and planning. But it just occurs to me, wouldn't it be great if we could start building a national database of essentially build our own baseline data? And, you know, that is doable conceivably going forward if we start collecting failure data in a similar manner.
Once we all get the consistent data, then we can.
Yep. Once we adopt. Yep, exactly. Larry.
Yep. There's MTBF is a great metric, and it's used in a whole variety of other industries, obviously. But there's also a funky level of abstraction around the number. Have you come up with any way of trying to explain what the number itself kind of means? Because they can be really obscenely large and, again, kind of abstract. And the trouble I've had in the past is, unless you're speaking to someone other than the choir, they're looking at you like you're talking in Japanese or something. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's just I don't know. I'm not sure I have a pat answer. Obviously what it's really about is how often does this thing break? And if it doesn't break very often, then that's good. And if it breaks a lot, we want to know about that. So that's as far as I've gotten. That's got to be Larry Fenico. It really sounds like one.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
I like what Vincent has done. I think it's a percentage, an occurrence, a percentage of the PMs or a percentage of the overtime.
Right.
How many correctives do you have, across the PMs?
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit of the approach that I take in forecasting replacements and whatnot. But yeah, that idea of change over time is, at least in our industry, when we're talking with clinicians, trends are central to diagnostics and treatment, right? I mean, they see the number on the screen and that's fine. I'm glad there's a number there, but I'm really, as a clinician, thinking over the last hour, over the last day, over the last week, right? I'm thinking in trends and I'm treating based on trends. So that sort of concept tends to resonate in our industry. Yeah.
So one of the things we've also been trying to keep in the back of our minds through all of this work is sort of learning to speak like the rest of the world speaks about things. So for Larry, you made a good point. MTBF is well recognized in lots of different industries. And so why don't we use the same kind of jargon when we talk to people? And I'll give you another example in risk assessment. There are a variety of ways to approach that, but the standard way in many industries is a combination of the severity of a failure and the probability of that failure. And so we need to start talking in those terms and add some, if we want to talk about probability, MTBF is a good measure. Is this failure mode common or not? So it's all part of that ulterior motive. The more we can communicate well with our regulatory colleagues, our clinical colleagues, our colleagues in other industries, the more we're going to be able to learn from them too, and I think get some credibility.
And data is one of those things where the number is, and this is Carol, my personal bias is, it's a number. But the thing I learned and heard over and over and over in school was, we do these giant back in the day, blackboard math problems. And at the end, the professor always said, does that number make sense? Yep. It's a number. Does it make sense? Did we get an answer to the question? What question were we asking at the beginning? Or were we just doing an academic exercise of number manipulation, right? No, in engineering school, we had a problem. Here's the equation we used to figure it out. Did that number make sense at the end? What does it tell me? What's the story around that data? So to your point, Larry, I think it's a big number, it's a little number, it's just a number until we tell the story about it. Other questions for Matt? You're cruising. We're doing good here. Okay.
Okay, over to you, Carol.
Here we go. All right, so I'm going to spend some time. I haven't written the book on this yet, but I've been working in this space for forecasting equipment needs for many years now. Almost an obsession. My poor husband has to deal with it even when we do like home appliances or whatnot. I'm sorry, I have to do a tech assessment on this, right? It's like, okay, I'm gonna go sit in the, you know, in the TV section. You tell me when you're done. So I can't help it, right? It's in my DNA. All right. So why do I call them strategic technology plans? Because I believe they should be strategic. You know, as I was growing up in this field, they were often, I would call them letters to Santa. Here's what I want for Christmas, right? I mean, it was like a wish list. But our organizations can't work off of wish lists. They have strategies, and the technology has to fit into it too, needs to be strategic and thoughtful. And for us in the HTM world, there's some really good reasons why we should be part of that, if not in a leadership role. Maybe not the leader, but in a leadership role, making sure that technology decisions are strategic. We want to be able to influence that spending, right? How often do you get frustrated because dollars are spent on something when you know there is a bigger need somewhere else, right? Right? Yeah, every day, 3 times a day, right? Communicate. For every conference we go to now, there's sessions about how do I communicate with executives. It's back to this idea of we got to tell a story, and we have to tell a story in their language, right? So I try to help create tools that enable you to have a conversation at the executive level that they'll listen to, because they don't care about the bits and bytes that we deal with, right? It's just wah, 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 wah to them. Okay. And then selfishly, we need to align our own resources. We need to make sure that we're spending our time where it drives the most value, right? So it's really important to be part of this and to provide leadership, not just followership in this space. So how do we do that? Well, we got to grab our data like we've been talking about all morning, right? And there's a lot of different factors. Most of the organizations that I start working with are looking at a couple of basic things. Is it depreciated? Oh, I get to buy a new one. No, you don't. Hopefully not. It's old, by whose definition, right? And is that age even right? Because was the buy date recorded right in either the CMMS or in the accounting records? Maybe, maybe not, right? Or I don't like it, I want a new one, right? I mean, or occasionally we're guilty of saying, this thing's a dog, it's a pain for me to take care of, right? I mean, we do that sometimes, right? But the data behind it, we don't always have it. So I'm going to focus on a couple of the factors that I've used when I was responsible for my organization, and now as I work as a consultant. A couple of primary factors. So industry factor, end of life, define it, right? These are very specific things. End of manufacturing, that's a yellow flag for me. Like, I have to start paying attention. End of service and support, parts, service from the manufacturer is a red flag to me. I really have to pay attention. Doesn't mean I'm going to replace it. It means I have to really pay attention, because now I have to understand, do I have alternative sources for those things or not? Because it's not, you don't always have a third party to go to on some devices, right? So there's a yellow flag, a red flag. I document both of those, because then I'm forecasting, right? I'm not looking for the thing that I need to do in the next 12 minutes. I'm looking at the things I need to do in the next 12 months, the next 24 months, the next 36 months, right? Okay. Those are our industry, sort of the electromechanical sort of factors that I look at first. Then the health system factors, these are things that are unique to me. What is the chronological age? How much confidence do I have that the day it was installed is accurate in my data? If my client's data is good, we use that. If it's a, then we don't use it, right? Because it's just going to cloud the decisioning. And then more recently, we're working with reliability, and this is where we tie back to the morning, right? We look at the maintenance metrics, okay? And you'll get these slides so you can see the little eye chart. Don't worry about that right now, but understand that when we're scoring technically, it's not one thing. It's a series of things that build to say, where am I in my risk back to the probability of there being a problem, right? And the severity of that problem. So let's dig into reliability. So a couple of the metrics that I've been working on lately, because we know where our data is, it's not great. We have to start out more simplistic, right? Let's not overcomplicate this thing right out of the gate. Let's mature our measures as we mature our data. So we start with simple things like, how many corrective maintenance work orders do I have on this device? Or on this class of devices, if I'm looking at a fleet versus an individual device. And do I want to look at the number of, to keep it very technical and not financial, how many labor hours am I spending on that? So I could count either or both of those things and use those as scores. And then, as Matt described, I use the very same formula for mean time between failure. Again, back to his point, you can look at it by a particular device, by a fleet, only the PM, only the corrective, however you might want to square that up. Again, this is back to define your metric first, define what you're trying to, what classifies your device might need to be replaced, right? That's the question. When do I need to replace this? So think about that. What do I need to measure there? And then I look at it over time. I work with my clients, and when I was in the hospital, we would say, what is the mean time between failure from when we got it to today? And that's the baseline over the entire life. Now, what has it been for the last, and this moves with people, but like over the last year, over the last 3 years, some shorter term period, right? And then we set a threshold. Has that changed more than some percentage, right? So let's say, has that changed more than 10% in either direction, right? Over the difference between those, is recent 10% higher than the life or 10% lower than the full life? How has it changed? And then if it tricks that threshold, if it's more than, and we'll just use for simplicity, if it's more than 10%, then we say, is it better or worse? Does that set a green flag because it's better? Whew, life's better. We figured out whatever the initial thing was. This thing isn't, not a problem. Or if it's worse, then we're degrading. Its performance is degrading. Its availability is degrading. So we're going to set at least a yellow flag. We need to pay attention to this. This needs to factor into our forecast. We need to watch it closely. Same thing in the clinical space. So again, back to a lot of the health organizations that I work with, look at maybe only one type of criteria. Maybe they only look at the financial. Maybe they only look at the technical. Maybe they only look at the clinical. I'm a firm believer that you have to look at all three of those to make a really strategic decision. So our data can actually help our clinician partners. So from their industry factors, they're looking at what are the clinical protocols I need to adhere to? Do I have the right tools for those? What are the regulatory requirements that I have to adhere to get paid or for clinical practices and whatnot? So those are ones that's really in their domain and they have to answer those questions. But if we get down into some of these health system factors, we start getting into these real murky conversations about workflow and utilization and things like that. We can help from a data perspective to pull utilization data, because it's in a lot of those boxes. On the imaging side anyway, where the big dollars are spent, that thing's clicking, right? It's keeping track of all of that data. It's in there. We just gotta go get it, right? Anesthesia machines, ventilators, we've been tracking those odometers for decades, right? So there's utilization data available that we can provide to them. But we can also do measures on our own in terms of our interactions with the clinicians. So let's go back to, again, some reliability metrics. How often do you hear the clinician say, it doesn't work? There may be some truth behind that, but what we need to find out is it because of the device? So maybe we want to look at the reliability of the device, like we were talking before. Maybe this device is poorly designed, has horrible human factors, and so it's a use issue, right? So maybe this is a work order that looks at the number of user support events that you've had to do so that the clinicians could actually use this tool. Now that data is super helpful. One, it may support their argument, and we need to tell the story a little different, right? It's not that the device isn't working, it's just really hard to use, right? And so that sort of, we all know, like, we don't like to use really hard to use tools. They're not tools anymore, now they're disablers, right? So that's important. So now the question is, did we just not train our people well or at all? I mean, in today's world, I see that happen all the time. Technology gets thrown out there and the clinicians never get trained. The only person that got trained on it was the person that happened to be standing at the booth at the conference. So you want to call that training, right? So it could be a training issue. And so it comes off your capital list because you found another way to solve that problem. Or it could be insight that says, yes, we're going to replace this device. There's no fixing it. We've trained these people 6 ways to Sunday. It's just a disabling device. So now that becomes part of your criteria as you think about what do I want to replace with, right? I don't want to just buy another one that's hard to use. I want to factor this into my thinking about what it is when this comes up for replacement, what am I going to put in its place? All right, same sort of thing, same sort of scoring, same sort of math. That's the mechanics are all the same. And then you've got all these technical, clinical, and financial metrics that you're working with here, and you got to use a little bit of maybe some Boolean algebra, some if and then and or to make some decisions. This goes back again a little bit to your organizational priorities and strategies. I prefer to use as much simple summation as possible because weighting immediately adds in bias, right? It adds in assumptions, it adds in politics, it adds in things that are squishy, right? And the idea of these strategic plans is you make them as objective as possible, as data-driven as possible for the baseline of your organization to use to then make your decisions. After you have this objective data-driven baseline, you can add all the politics and assumptions and whatnot on top of it, but at least you're starting from someplace that is a bit more or a lot more objective. So this is you kind of get into this sort of a blending, right? If the top line, if all the clinical and the technical and financial scores are coming out, hey, this thing's green light, go, there's not risk factors, then you're like, okay, I'm going to worry about that in 5 years, right? It's on the plan, but we don't need to worry about this for probably a good 5 years. It gets more murky when you get down sort of in the middle of this grid where you got maybe the clinical thing is yellow because maybe the protocols are changing, or maybe it is one of those disabling devices. But technically, it's super easy for us we got ports, we can get parts, we can get service, it's going to be manufactured for another 10 years, whatever, it's going to be bright green for us, right? So then it's like your organization then has to say, okay, which is more important here? And financially might help. It might say, well, it's depreciated. We see the clinical delivery issues, so we're going to go ahead and replace this, right? If it's not depreciated, then it gets even squirrelier, right? Well, you guys can fix it. It's not depreciated, but it's a disabler. But at least then your executives can have a more informed conversation and make more informed decisions. Understand what they're leaving on the table, as the saying goes, right? So the places where I have the question marks, that's where you really have to understand what are your organizational priorities and how do they make decisions to be able to anticipate what that color might be, right? The others are much more straightforward, sort of logical. This and this and this means this, okay? Now, you may be asking, well, why do you do the colors? Why the colors? having spent time in execuland, as I like to call it, I always laugh. I'm like, really? Really? Like, you don't want to, honest to God, you don't have time to even think about thinking, right? And so what this, by representing the data back to telling the story, if you will, this helps me get people's attention quickly. I don't want them worrying about the green stuff. Logically and just subconsciously, the stoplight thing works. Green light, I keep driving. I just keep going, right? I don't stop, I just keep going. I mean, I'm hopefully paying attention as I drive, but I keep going. Yellow, I need to see what's going on. Red, I need to stop and really see what's going on here, right? It works. I'm a convert, if you will, right? As an executive, this helps you get them to focus right in where you want them to pay attention. Now, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to take that recommendation. The red things are high risk for us. These are things that have high visibility. We need to pay attention to them. Yellows, we need to. I would say in general, probably 15 to 20% of the inventories I look at of any given inventory falls in the red. It just depends, right? Sometimes it's even less than that. Sometimes it's more around 10%. It's red. The bulk of things that you need people to pay attention to are yellow, right? But the red, what makes this easy is that you can go red, boom, boom, boom. These are like no-brainers. Yep, I got it. Let's move on. And they can focus their attention on the yellows and have concrete, well-informed, productive conversations. So how do you get to this? And how do we tie this back to the earlier session? Make a plan. Always make a plan. So your first plan is, are you going to, or the first decision is, are you going to adopt the recommended standards? So that's kind of the first plan. What are we going to do with our CMMS to get really good data? If you're not there already, right? The second one, this is a plan to help you lay out, what do I need to be able to do this strategic planning with and for my organization? What are the data points? And you can do this in parallel because cleaning up our data is going to take a while. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight either, right? But this, if you decide why it's important to clean the data, then you can set some priorities. If tech planning or the AEM program are important, then what are the data points I need to do those activities? And this is just a worksheet I share with you that I use occasionally when it's not just obvious, to say, here are the things I want to use to measure, whether it's from a technical perspective or the clinical perspective. Here's the data points I need out of my CMMS. Can I get them? Because if you can't get them, don't, for God's sake, don't put them in your plan. Right, yeah, don't put them in the plan that you're gonna put on the stoplight report to the executives. Now you've just undone your credibility, right? But put them on your plan to enhance. Tell them, here's what we measure today because we have high confidence in this data. Here's what's coming as we are able to make and refine this for you even more. That will build your credibility with those folks. So that's what I have. It's just in the slides when you download them, you can print this one again. I just put it in there big. Actually, we can put it up there so you've got copies. If anybody didn't get a copy, I will. But just know the reliability metric, the top is what am I going to measure? The next row is do I have the data pieces to get to it from both a work order and a failure code perspective. And then that baseline average, back to our earlier conversation, right? I'm going to measure over the lifetime, but what's the smaller, what am I comparing it to? Am I comparing it to the last 12 months? Am I comparing it to the last 3 years? And what's the percentage change that's allowable? What's my threshold to flip the flag, so to speak? Cool. All right.